Welcome to Breaking the News Plus on this Wednesday evening. Tonight, I'm going to talk to my colleague AJ Legault, who is in Washington, D.C. He is there to cover the House Oversight Committee hearing that included Governor Tim Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison today. They were on the hot seat to talk fraud in front of this committee. AJ, thanks for joining us tonight.
Yeah, Jana, you got me on the hot seat now.
Yeah, I guess so. So let's talk about the hot seats. Governor Walz and AG Ellison in front of this committee known that they're going to be tough on people like Walz and Ellison. So were they as tough as expected?
It was definitely a contentious, testy hearing at times here in the nation's capital as Governor Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison testified. Certainly, GOP Minnesota Rep. Tom Emmer came into the hearing. He was waved in and had some, pretty heated questions, if you will, asking what did Governor Walz and what did Keith Ellison know about the fraud and when did they actually know it? There was a report that got released just hours before this hearing began, and it was labeled, and I'm pulling it up here to look, the cost of doing nothing, how Tim Walz and Keith Ellison fueled Minnesota's fraud explosion. That was a staff report released by this House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform by, of course, the GOP members. And as I've been trying to wade through it, it's a lengthy report, about 52 pages. It doesn't seem to really have any smoking guns, but it certainly lays out, years of questions that have been raised about how Feeding Our Future was responded to and how some of these other fraud scandals like housing stabilization and autism services were handled. They interviewed a number of current and former employees, leaders at the Minnesota Department of Human Services, trying to get at what people knew and when did they know.
Well, AJ, most of the folks that watch us know that you have been covering this fraud from the beginning for years at this point. And you probably have more information than people on that committee. So in your experience and from what you know, when you sat in that room today, was anything new uncovered, or was it just a matter of our leaders being held accountable by some members of Congress?
It really was a lot of what we've all been reporting on and what many folks in Minnesota probably have read or watched on the news over the course of years being rehashed on a national stage. As this, what was a local problem in Minnesota has certainly exploded into a national fight. And they were taking a look back all the way back to 2019 when Governor Walz took office, and who did what, when, what was he told by whom about Feeding Our Future, which exploded in 2020. That was the pandemic era food scandal for children who were out of school, and all these sites that were being paid millions of dollars to not provide food. They were making up kids, making up meals. And that's really where a lot of the fraud really exploded onto the scene in Minnesota. Now we're talking back 6 years ago, and there's been a lot of debate over why the state allowed funds to keep going after they tried to stop it, and there was some court action. That's all getting rehashed here again. And then certainly questions about housing stabilization. How did a program start at just a couple $1 million and explode in cost to over $100 million in just a matter of a couple years without it raising red flags? That's a question we've been asking for a year now.
Right, and that's actually what I was just going to ask you. The whole question of who knew what and when did they know it is a question that you and your team have been asking for the better part of 6 years.
Yeah, it absolutely is. We've been trying to kind of get to the heart of that now through a number of open records requests. As part of our reporting process, we have learned that there were a number of complaints, a number of actual allegations of fraud, even some very detailed allegations of fraud that were given to the State Human Services Department. And it seems like nothing was done for the better part of a year. And that, of course, all changed in the spring of 2025. As you know, we started really doing some explosive reports on how housing stabilization was being abused with phantom billing and, forged records. And at that time, over this past year or so, it's been top priority in Minnesota. So our leaders have certainly been taking it seriously over the last year, but questions still certainly remain about how we got to this point, where just last January, the DHS commissioner, Jody Harpstead, told a Senate hearing that there was more rumors of fraud than there was actual fraud, and fraudsters were too scared of the DHS Inspector General to even try committing Medicaid fraud. And we know those quotes certainly didn't age very well.
Yeah, it's simply not true. I couldn't watch all of it. I did see an interesting exchange, because a lot of times these hearings are really more for like pulling sound bites for whichever politician. Both Democrats and Republicans try to, get the C-SPAN sound bite.
Their cable news network of choice, yeah.
Yeah, like this is kind of where they try to shine for their constituents by scoring some points. There was an interesting exchange between Governor Walz and Texas Republican Representative Pete Sessions. And the governor said to Representative Sessions, as governor, I've taken accountability for this. I'm not going to run again. I need to spend the time fixing this. This does undermine trust in government, and I certainly understand it happened on my watch. In the last year, we have seen Governor Walz finally take some responsibility here. Whether he knew something or didn't know something, it doesn't tend to matter, because he's the quarterback. He's the head of the state. These are his agencies. And by not running again, he seems to be, at least in this exchange, taking responsibility. Did that exchange land well in terms of the testimony, or what was the reaction to it?
I think that was one of the more civil, grown-up exchanges that we saw in this hearing between Governor Walz and Congressman Sessions, where they seem to actually be agreeing on some things, having a civil conversation, not interrupting each other. And Governor Walz had said this before back, at home in Minnesota, and, spelled it out very clearly now that he's not trying to pass the buck on responsibility, that, the buck does stop with him and he takes ownership and responsibility and is, trying to get this fixed for whoever is going to be our next governor.
And, we, as you point out rightly, we've known that at home, or at least he said that at home. People can choose to believe what they want. This has gone on for so long, and it's certainly weighed on the hearts and minds of Minnesotans, and now it's just being pushed in this national stage. I can't help but think of the parallels to what we saw happen in December, when that conservative YouTuber puts his video out about fraud, and it takes on a whole new life. And it's basically the origin point for Operation Metro Surge that happened here over the course of a couple of months. And what's interesting as Minnesotans, for those of you watching, this is stuff we already knew. We had already gone on record with. There's nothing in that video from that YouTuber that was brand new evidence. And so it's like taking on a second life of its own. And so it's really actually kind of a political science test of this stuff was already out there, but now it's got some rocket fuel to it. And today might have been one of those days too.
It was clear to see the framing that was going on between the right and the left. The GOP was framing this entire hearing about fraud as Governor Walz should have known or knew, or as I said, at the very least should have known and didn't act quick enough and needs to be held accountable. And Governor Walz and Attorney General Ellison and their Democratic counterparts here in Congress were certainly framing this around just what you were talking about, Jana, of the immigration tactics and what happened when President Trump announced that he was launching this immigration crackdown in Minnesota in response to fraud and what was seen in some of that YouTuber's video. And this was a quote, I'm pulling it up here from Governor Walz's opening statement. He said, "The people of Minnesota have been singled out and targeted for political retribution at an unparalleled scale, including blocking Medicaid reimbursements to our state just last week under the guise of combating fraud. The federal government has flooded Minnesota with masked, untrained, and unaccountable agents who are wreaking havoc in our communities." And you saw that refrain, that framing of this issue echoed by many on the left in this hearing.
Right, and therein it becomes that political theater that even before you had your ticket scanned to go to Washington, D.C., you knew what you were walking into. And lastly, AJ, I just want to talk about, kind of on top of that, these hearings, they aren't meant to have any teeth to them. It doesn't mean something happens because of them, right? It's just for these folks to have these exchanges on C-SPAN and post them on social media, so the public that elects them knows what they did or said.
Yeah, I mean, I think the value is the public gets to see the questions asked. They get to hear some answers. Very often the people being interviewed and asked to testify barely get to speak because they get interrupted because the Congress folks that are asking the question only get a couple minutes. And so they very jealously guard their time to ask their questions without ever really listening to an answer. And so there's a lot of that political theater that you just talked about. But there is some value in the discussions being had, but there's no real outcome. I doubt we see laws changed or see anything with real teeth, as you mentioned, that comes from this.
Yeah, and I don't want to discredit that value. People want to see who they voted for, no matter which state they're in. They want to see the questions that are asked. They want to see how they're framed and the behaviors and stuff like that. So there is value. There is transparency there for the voters to see how this issue is talked about on a national stage. But it's all wrapped up now.
If you came into this hearing, Jana, and you believe that the governor and attorney general should be out of a job because they didn't do enough to stop fraud, you probably don't have your mind changed. And if you came into this hearing to watch it and believe that signs were missed, but there's a good faith effort now underway, and that this fraud's just being used as a pretext for immigration crackdowns and all the fallout there, your mind probably wasn't changed.
Well, alrighty then. So the politics stay as they do. AJ, we thank you for joining us from Washington, D.C., as always, and for being on the show tonight.
Thank you, Jenna.
You bet. That's all for Breaking the News Plus on this Wednesday night. We will see you next time. Take care.